So, okay, we talked about MS. Obviously, after that, you did the very popular thing of moving to private equity, right? A lot of people, honestly, I think a lot of people go into banking just for the purpose of ending up in private equity, even, right? And so you got to TPG. Obviously, you had to go through on-cycle recruiting for that. On-cycle recruiting is notoriously competitive and just kind of a wild process where everything happens within like one weekend,
Yeah,
right?
that's right.
So can you talk about what that process was like for you? What was that experience like? Just kind of describe it for people who don't know what on cycle is, I
Yeah,
guess.
sure. So first of all, I was interested in private equity when I was at Jefferies, and I could not get an interview anywhere. And so just to like make it very clear how impactful the Morgan Stanley transition was, like I got to Morgan Stanley in October. I think we joined in October of 2009. Within, I think it was less than 6 months later, I was getting like, pinged from the headhunters about every major mega fund private equity firm and their recruiting processes. And once one goes, they all goes. There's like a week where all of a sudden you're scheduling interviews at every possible place. I was very lucky that I was very lucky to get those interviews. They do screen out a lot of people. There were a lot of funds that declined to do a first interview with me,
Yeah.
even while we were at Morgan Stanley. I think the reason why TPG and several others were willing to interview was I had a good reviews from the people I was working with at Morgan Stanley. So as you can imagine, all the partners in these private equity firms know all of the managing directors and kind of senior people at the banks. And so when
Right.
they're going through, it's still hundreds of resumes, I'm sure, across different banking groups. They're
Yeah.
calling and they're asking, who are your best analysts? Who do you like to work with? Who's really sharp? And I think when those calls were made on my resume, I was able to get in the interview process. So that helped a lot. So I would say, do a good job in your banking job, because that's going to be, your references are going to be a huge part of your success in getting a private equity job if you want one. And it was
Absolutely.
true. Like the senior folks at Morgan Stanley were so supportive in a way that I was very grateful for. And it
Yeah.
honestly, it made me want to work hard for them for the remaining year and a half that I was an analyst, because I just wanted to kind of show that I wasn't there to just kind of get a job and then phone it in. And then in the process itself, it was pretty intense. We did phone screens. It all kind of happens really fast. So you do phone screens, you get called in for interviews. The headhunters are scheduling flights for you if you want to go down to LA or go to New York. You have to be able to explain your story for the fund that's talking to you. So, I talked to credit funds, I talked to equity funds, and the credit funds were much more interested in my restructuring background, even though I was at Morgan
Right.
Stanley.
Right.
The equity funds were more interested in the software coverage that we had in tech at Morgan Stanley.
Yeah.
Ironically, I was doing a lot of work in like solar and in internet. Like I worked on the Facebook IPO. So you have to be very kind of conscious. And again, I talked to friends about how to make sure that I catered my responses and my experience to what that firm was looking for. The best way to do that is, in the middle of all the chaos, try to do mock interviews with friends in private equity, and let them poke holes in your resume, let them challenge you, ask them to get you to the point where you don't know how to answer. Because if you can get to that level of discomfort with someone you trust in a no risk environment, then you're going to be ready for that when it comes up in kind of the kind of very nerve-wracking suit and tie, interview process. And one of my friends was at Golden Gate Capital. He was actually the best man at my wedding. He was at Golden Gate Capital. I was interviewing at TPG. It was like similar. It was like a Sunday night. And, we went through the first round of interviews, and then they said, go get something to eat and we'll call you if we want you to come back. And so I called my friend at Golden Gate. He was working that Sunday, and I was like, hey, do you want to grab a bite to eat? I'd love to just like decompress. And so we went and got dinner together, and I was kind of sitting there staring at my phone, hoping that TPG would call back and have me come back. And fortunately they did. And so I went back at like 11 p.m. on a Sunday night and did my final round interview. And then the next day, the head of the tech group called and said, we'd love to have you come work for us. So, it's really intense. I would say luck favors the prepared, right? In the midst of an intense banking job, lots of hours, lots of exhaustion, train and practice, practice LBO modeling, practice interviewing, get advice from your friends, because as soon as the bat signal goes up and everyone's interviewing, it happens really fast. And I'm sure I'm 15 years detached now, but I'm sure it's still the case now.
And the biggest difference between like the investment banking interview process and the private equity interview process, I'm assuming it was the same back then, but is that they actually put you through modeling tests,
Yes.
right? Yeah. Whereas like for banking is, you just verbally answering questions. They're not going to like, give you a laptop and make you build out a model from scratch or whatever. But for all the private equity firms, you pretty much are going to have to build some sort of LBO model, usually from scratch. And it's under time pressure. You have anywhere from maybe 1 to 4 hours, depending on how complex the model is. And so that a lot of times I think trips people up, especially those who aren't prepared. And I think back then, we had the luxury of actually being on the job for a few months before we had to do that. And so at least you were getting reps at work. But even the reps you're getting at work, you're using like templates and
Right.
you're just like, plugging in numbers. It's not the same thing as building from scratch. Right now, they're doing on cycle, just like banking. Everything moves up earlier. Now they're doing, I think last year they did on cycle in like June, like of
Wow.
your first year. So like you don't have time on the job yet, and you don't actually have live reps yet, except for maybe what you did over the summer. But during the summer, when you're an intern, you're not really getting that many modeling reps anyway. So like you really have to prepare on your own, like, way ahead of time, even. And I hear intense stories like, I mean, you getting to leave and grab dinner with your friend and then come back at 11 p.m. I hear now it's so competitive that like sometimes the firms will hold you there in the conference room and not let you leave because they don't want you to go interview with their competitors.
Right, right,
Uh,
right.
unless they cut you, then you can leave, right? It's just like such a crazy process, honestly, but obviously for good reason because it's extremely rewarding if you do get in. And so like what was that experience like at TPG, I guess?
Yeah.
Because like obviously you worked at MS, that's like probably one of the best groups you could have worked at for banking purposes, and then you go to TPG and you were still doing tech there, right? How was that different from say like doing tech banking, I guess?
Yeah. I mean, it's a totally different job. The financial modeling and kind of external company engagement aspects of it could be viewed as similar, but it's a very different job. So a few things that I would say. Number one, when I was interviewing for private equity jobs, every private equity firm has a reputation among all the analysts, right? Some are super intense, some you're going to get crushed, you're going to work really hard, some the people are really nice. And I would say just as you enter into that kind of chaos, don't believe everyone's view. It's important to gather views, but don't believe everyone's view. There were actually folks that I knew that were like, "Hey, even if you get this offer at TPG, just be careful because like it's a really intense place. It's really tough to work. Like the people are mean." That was not true at all. Like TPG had some of the nicest and smartest people I have ever worked with, and I never felt like I was mistreated or spoken down to. I was always treated with a ton of respect. I was
Yeah.
pushed. The people there are so good at what they do that
Yeah.
I was pushed to learn faster and to work harder and to get things done more quickly. TPG was just I really miss being inside the walls of that place because the people were very smart and very kind. And so that was just on the environment side. I was lucky to be there for the years I was there. As it relates to the work you're doing, it's very different. In banking, so much of your job is advisory. It's benchmarking. It's giving guidance to companies on how they might want to navigate a specific situation. It's very transactional in that sense. And at least in my younger years in banking, one of the things I look back on is when you're doing benchmarking and you're comparing different companies and you're giving advice on them, you're not going deep enough to really appreciate how different some of those businesses are. And that really
Mhm.
started to become more clear when you go into the buy side and you really have to think about differences in business models and valuations, et
Yeah.
cetera. So like the example I like to give is in banking, you would look at Qualcomm and Intel as comps, right? They're both chip makers. They both
Yeah.
have, they kind of fit into the industry categories, the sector coverage, et cetera. They are wildly different business models, right? Qualcomm, so much of its earnings are tied to royalties. That's not at all what Intel does. In private equity, you really start unpacking that. You really start saying, well, if I'm looking at this company and I'm thinking about the merits of acquiring it and owning it for the next 3 to 5 years, there's a bunch of work you do standalone. And then there's a bunch of competitive work that you do to understand how does it compete with, how does it compare to other peers in its space, and
Yeah.
the things that make them different, even if you believe they're very similar businesses, the things that make them different are really the parts you really want to get into because that's what determines whether it might be a good investment or it might be a terrible investment. So
Yeah.
um, the intensity of the work And the kind of work you do, I think, is much deeper and more intrusive in private equity than it is in banking. And the two things that I'll call out that TPG kind of trained all of us on, and I still use them today, are WRM, what really matters, and
Mm,
WYNTB, what you need to believe. So,
mm,
and we use these at ServiceNow on my team. What really matters at the end of the day, you can learn how to do an LBO model, you can build the mechanics in Excel. What really matters is what is driving the business from a top line and cost perspective.
yes.
Part of your goal, even if you're studying the business top to bottom for, a month, is to really distill it down to what are the top 2 to 3, 3 to 5 things that really matter. If you can get those things right, you've de-risked, 80% of your 90% of your thesis. That's really hard to do. It sounds simple, right? Einstein said, if you don't know it, you can't explain it simply, you don't know it well enough, right?
Yeah.
So simplifying things requires that you go really deep, but then that you come back up to the surface and you articulate what really matters. And
Yeah.
then you take that and you say, what do you need to believe, or what you need to believe in order for this to be a good investment? What
Mm,
needs to happen to those 2 or 3 or 5 levers that you've identified? And what are the key risks around that, right? Is the demand environment for the software business that you're acquiring into, is it changing? Are there competitive threats that could be existential for that business? How do enterprises adopt this? Are the sales cycles going to be impacted? What if there's something that changes in federal and you have a big kind of federal exposure, and then there's a lot of vertical software. So you're getting industry specific risk. Even if you're still investing in a software business, if you're doing it in oil and gas or energy, you're levered to the spending and investment cycles in that industry. It can feel really complicated, but so much of private equity is doing all of the work, doing 100% of the work because you're not sure which 5% is going to matter, and then figuring out which 5% matters and really leaning into that.
yeah. Oh man, that was so good. Hopefully everyone's taking notes because that's like you're getting inside the head of like how a real professional investor thinks about different investments, right? Yeah, I would say, just to kind of add a little bit to what you said, my own experience going from banking to PE was like it was a big adjustment because I feel like in banking, after a while, the job almost became easy because like not easy in terms of like the hours are obviously still long, but like you've done everything so many times. I've done comps, I've done M&A models, I've done DCFs. Like, after you do those things a couple times, you kind of know how to do them and you can do them with your eyes
Yeah,
closed,
that's right.
basically. Right. And you get really fast at processing, and then you take orders from your MD or your VP or your director or whoever, and you just go and crank whatever you need to do, crank it out, and then you're just trying to get home.
Yes.
And that was like, in a way, it almost like, I'm not saying like this is what the best analysts are doing, but if you just wanted to get by, you don't really have to think that deeply, to be completely honest, about a lot of things you're doing. After like, I would say like maybe for the first 6 months, you're drinking from the fire hose, and the learning curve is super steep. And after that, it kind of flattens out, right? And I got to PE and it's like, man, you're constantly expected to have thoughts and opinions about whatever company it is you're evaluating. You can't just not really think about what you're doing. You actually have to, like a lot of the work that your MD was doing for you in banking, where they're actually thinking about like what should go on the slide and what are the points that we're trying to make, like they expect you to do that now as an associate in PE. And so if you weren't building that muscle back when you were an IB analyst and you were just kind of cruising, you're not going to suddenly just know how to do it. And then so there's almost like this adjustment period where in the beginning, you're probably not going to be very good.
Yeah.
And so I would encourage people, it's like, even though you could get by that way in banking, if your goal is to go to the buy side, you should start practicing those muscles while you're an analyst. And in a way, if you're doing that as an analyst in banking, you're almost like going above and beyond, as weird as that sounds. But like that's what's going to make you better at your next job, when that's just like the normal expectation.
Yeah, that's
Right.
that's right. And maybe to put it very simply, when you're doing work in banking on a specific company, you're not asked the question, would you buy this company? You're not asked like, is this the best company to invest in at this price?
Yeah.
And that's like that was a flip that, even admittedly, I wish I had thought more in that way in banking to get ready for private equity, because I don't think I was good at that as fast as I needed to be when I got to TPG. And
Mm.
I learned a lot while I was at TPG. I learned a lot in the buy side post TPG, but I could have been better at that faster if I had taken, that mentality in banking.
Yeah. For sure.
It's hard to, like you said, you're working a lot of hours, you're so preoccupied with just getting the work done and trying to get a few hours of sleep every night that it's hard to think through, what else should you be doing to advance your career, but it's really important.
Yeah, for sure.